I was only 19 when he asked me to marry him, and I was still wearing my work apron, dusted with flour and sun, standing behind the counter of Miss Lillian's bakery, with my hair all pinned wrong and my hands smelling like vanilla and yeast. He had just come in from the base, uniform slightly wrinkled, hat in hand, face flushed in that way that made my heart skip, like he had run the last few blocks just to see me. He didn't kneel, not in the traditional way, not with roses or candles, or a speech rehearsed in his head. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring, thin, no stone, just smooth and cool and shining like morning dew. And he said, "Mary Ellen, I don't have much, but if you'll have me, I swear I'll never stop loving you." And my knees almost gave out right there between the raspberry turnovers and the cinnamon buns. I said yes before the word even fully formed in his mouth. I said it like breathing, like something I'd been waiting to say my whole life without knowing it. And the customers clapped, and Miss Lillian cried. And when he slipped the ring onto my finger, my whole world tilted in the most beautiful way. Like suddenly the sky had a purpose, and it was written in silver. His name was Thomas Ray Bennett, but everyone called him Tommy. And I never called him anything but that. Never needed to, because Tommy was the kind of name that fit a boy with soft hands and soldier shoulders. A boy who read poetry under his breath and whistled when he was nervous. A boy who kissed you on the cheek before he kissed your lips, just to make sure you wanted it too. He was drafted 6 weeks later. They called it a conflict, a mission, a duty. But we all knew it was a war, even if no one wanted to say it too loud. The Vietnam War. Some far-off jungle with names I couldn't pronounce. Some place where boys turned into names on plaques and mothers buried letters like they were bones. We didn't have time for a big wedding, just a church room and borrowed flowers. My sister's dress hemmed to fit me, and his brother standing in for his father, who couldn't stop crying. We said our vows under the glow of August light and ate strawberry pie instead of cake. And when he kissed me at the altar, I tasted salt and sugar and goodbye all at once. The morning he left, I packed him a lunch he never touched and tied a ribbon around his duffel bag, even though I knew it would get dirty within the hour. I pinned a photograph of us into his inside pocket, and he kissed my hand before anything else, like the ring meant more to him than his own name. At the train station, he reached for my fingers, traced the ring once, then slowly, gently, slid it off and held it in his palm. "Let me take it with me," he whispered, "so I don't forget what I'm coming home to." And though my heart stung with the space it left behind, I nodded, because somehow I knew it would be safer with him than on my hand in a world without him. He tucked the ring into a little pouch, worn leather and stitched by his grandmother, and I watched him press it close to his chest, right over his dog tags, right over his heart, and I thought, if love can survive distance, it will survive this too. I wrote to him every Sunday, same time, same table, same tea growing cold beside me. I wrote about the garden and my new shoes and how the church choir missed his baritone. I wrote about the way the leaves were changing and how the dogs still waited by the door at sunset. I wrote about the ache and the hope and the ache again, and I sealed every envelope with the same words, "Come home to me, my love, come home to me." His letters came slower than mine, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes out of order. Like time didn't work the same way over there, like words had to fight their way back to me, through mud and bullets and fear. But when they arrived, when they arrived, it felt like opening the window to spring after a long, cruel winter. He would write about the heat and the boys in his unit, about missing real coffee and clean socks and the smell of bread in the air. But mostly, he wrote about me, about us, about the porch swing he wanted to fix when he got back, about the names we might give our children, about how he traced the ring with his thumb every night before he fell asleep, as if that tiny circle of silver held everything he needed to remember who he was. He signed every letter with the same words, "Always yours, Tommy." There were days I couldn't breathe, days when the mail didn't come, when the news on the radio sounded too close, when the headlines felt like knives wrapped in paper. I'd sit on the steps and hold my own hand where the ring used to be, and pretend it was his. Then came the telegrams, not for me, but for others, for neighbors and classmates, for girls who used to braid their hair beside mine and now wore black to the grocery store. Every knock on the door made my heart twist like a rope pulled too tight, and I prayed every night, that I would never hear those 3 words, "We regret to inform." The world kept spinning, but slower, as if even time was holding its breath, and I clung to the idea of him like a raft in a storm. The ring no longer on my hand, but never once out of my heart. And then, the letters stopped, not slowly, not gradually, but like a door slammed shut in a house full of wind. No explanation, no warning, just silence. And silence is the cruelest sound, because it lets you imagine anything, everything, and the mind is not kind when left alone with fear. I went to the mailbox every day, even when I knew better. Even when the postman couldn't meet my eyes, I waited, and I waited, and I waited, until the day I stopped, until the day the door knocked, until the day they told me he was missing, not dead, not alive, just missing. They told me he was missing in action. Those 3 words, so clean, so formal, so clipped, as if sorrow could be trimmed to size, as if love could be filed under a report number and stored in a cabinet far from anyone who'd ever held his hand. I stood in the doorway as the man said it, the same uniform as the others, the same somber voice, and I nodded like I understood, like I accepted, but my chest was screaming in a language only silence could translate. He was missing, not dead, not confirmed, not found, not returned, not buried, just missing. And that word lived in my home, like an echo, bouncing off walls and windows, slipping into my tea, resting beside me in bed, clinging to my fingers where the ring used to be. And no matter how many times I lit a candle or whispered his name into the empty air, Missin answered back with nothing but stillness. The letters stopped coming, and with them, so did sleep. I'd sit up through the night watching the porch, light sway in the wind, a little flicker that refused to die out, like a signal, like a prayer blinking into the dark. I couldn't explain it, but I kept it on every night, even when the neighbors started asking if I'd forgotten to turn it off. Even when they offered to fix the wiring, I just smiled and said no thank you, because somewhere deep down, I believed that light still knew its purpose. I didn't pack his things. I couldn't. I left his boots by the door and his coat on the hook. I let the laundry basket sit with the last shirt he wore, still wrinkled, still smelling faintly of pine and soap. I dusted around his books and made the bed like he was coming back. And when people asked why I didn't move on, why I didn't take off the apron that still had his initials stitched in the corner, I said because I wasn't finished waiting. Waiting became a shape I carried in my body, a rhythm I walked with, a pattern in the way I stirred my tea, in the way I folded napkins, in the way I whispered his name just before I turned the key in the door, hoping, just once, it would open to the sound of his boots on the floorboards again. I went to the post office every Saturday, even when I told myself I wouldn't, even when my hands trembled before opening the little metal door. And sometimes there'd be nothing, sometimes just bills or flyers, but once there was a letter from the army, an update, they called it. And I opened it with the careful hands of someone holding her breath, only to read the same lines in different words. No change in status, still missing, still unaccounted for. I held that letter like it might bleed if I squeezed too hard, like it might confess something if I just stared long enough, but all it said was that they were looking, that they hadn't given up, and I knew they meant well, or maybe they didn't. Maybe they were just going through the motions, filing another page away so they could sleep at night, but I couldn't sleep. Not while he was still somewhere out there. Dreams were the cruelest part, because he came to me so clearly in them, his voice, his hands, the way he laughed with his eyes before his mouth caught up, and in one dream he stood at the foot of our bed, wearing his uniform and holding out the ring, saying I promised, and I woke up with my own voice echoing the same word into the dark, fingers grasping for something that wasn't there, and yet, even in the hollow spaces, I didn't stop writing to him. I wrote letters I never mailed, placed them in a tin box under the bed, each one dated, each one filled with the little details of life he was missing. The first snow, the way the neighbor's cat had kittens, the time the church choir sang our song and I had to excuse myself. Before the final verse, I wrote to him like he could still hear me, like maybe somewhere he was reading them, maybe injured, maybe lost, maybe alive in some quiet corner of the world where names and memories had blurred, but where love could still find a way through. Time, they say, is supposed to heal, but time is a terrible doctor. It doesn't mend, it hides, it covers things up in dust and routine and sighs that get heavier with age. And some days I could smile again, at a joke, at a child's laughter, at a breeze that felt like him, but the weight never left. It just shifted, moved deeper into the bones. The war dragged on, and headlines filled the spaces his letters used to hold. I clipped them, every article, every mention of his unit, every photograph with faces too blurry to recognize, and I looked for him in all of them, searching eyes, jawlines, hands, anything that might be his. And sometimes I thought I saw him, just for a second, just enough to let my heart break all over again. One day, years later, I received a package I didn't expect. Small, battered, no return address, just my name, written carefully, like someone afraid it might be lost again. And inside, wrapped in cloth and sealed in a pouch of worn leather, was the ring. His ring. Our ring. The one I had slipped onto my finger behind the bakery counter. The one he had taken with him when he left. The one he promised to bring back. No letter, no explanation. Just the ring. Just the weight of it in my palm. Just the circle of silver that had once held all our future and now held only questions. I held it to my lips and closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I cried without restraint, not the soft weeping of someone trying to be strong, but the kind that comes from a wound that never closed, from a love that refused to vanish, from the echo of footsteps that never returned. The next morning, I wore the ring again, not as a widow, not as a wife, but as someone who had been loved completely and was still waiting. I kept the ring on my finger like it had never left, like it had waited all those years just to feel the curve of my skin again. I twisted it slowly when I stirred my tea, when I folded laundry, when I sat on the porch and listened to the wind, and I tried not to let my mind wander too far, but it always did, because the ring came back without a story. And love, you see, cannot survive without story, without meaning, without the thread that ties it to memory. For days, I told no one, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to keep that piece of him to myself, just a little longer, as if speaking it out loud would make it float away, like dust or prayer, like a name whispered to far from home. I would sleep with the ring pressed against my lips, not weeping, not anymore, just listening, just wondering if he had held it one last time. If it had touched his skin before someone else tucked it into that pouch and sent it back to the only person who would know what it meant. The envelope it came in had no return address, but the postmark was from Colorado, a place I had never been, a place he had never mentioned, and I held it under the lamp, tilted it toward the light, hoping for a clue, for a fingerprint, for something that felt like him, but it was empty, except for a short, narrow slip of paper tucked between the folds of the cloth. No greeting, no signature. Just 5 words written in trembling handwriting. He told me to return it. I read that line over and over, as if the way I read it might change its meaning, as if tone could travel through ink, and I tried to hear his voice in it, but I couldn't. It wasn't him. The words were too small, too afraid, like someone who carried something precious but didn't understand why. For the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. I felt a thread, a pull, a purpose. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew I had to try. I had to find out who wrote that note, who had touched the ring, who had been close enough to Tommy to carry out a promise that never reached my ears. So I wrote a letter, short, careful, polite, and mailed it to the only address I had, the regional postal facility in Colorado, asking, gently, if there was any way to trace a package, if a record existed, if someone might remember seeing a man drop it off. I didn't expect much, but I needed to begin somewhere. Weeks passed with no reply, and I told myself to be patient, that nothing about love, or war, or healing ever happened quickly. But each day I checked the mailbox with a nervous flicker, the kind I hadn't felt since the first time I waited for his letters all those years ago. Then, one morning, a new envelope arrived, plain, cream-colored, with a postmark from Colorado Springs, and inside was a name, Private Nathaniel J. Carter. I sat down right where I stood, in the middle of the hallway, the letter still in my lap, because I knew that name, or thought I did. I ran back to the box where I had kept Tommy's letters, the tin box with the faded blue lid, and I opened them one by one, fingers trembling, searching, scanning for the name like it was buried treasure. And there it was, 3 letters in, a line scribbled almost as an afterthought. Tell Nate I still owe him that harmonica lesson. And later, Nate says hi, he's from Denver, makes terrible coffee but plays chess like a magician. And finally, if anything happens to me, I trust Nate. I sat in stillness with that last line echoing in my ears, not loud, not screaming, but soft, steady, like a heartbeat. and I realized Tommy had chosen someone, had trusted someone, had made a plan that he never got to finish, and that man, Nate, had carried it for him all these years. I didn't know what to expect, but I wrote again, this time directly to Nathaniel. If he still lived where the letter said, if he was still alive, I told him who I was, told him about the ring, about the note, about the silence. I told him that I wasn't angry, that I just wanted to understand, that the not knowing had become heavier than the grief. And 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, in tight, neat lines, and it began like this. Dear Mrs. Bennet, I hope you don't mind me calling you that. He spoke of you that way every single day, like your name was the rhythm that kept his heart steady. I wept before I read another word. He told me they met in the second month, both assigned to radio support, both quiet men in a sea of noise. That Tommy never talked much about the war, but talked about me like I was his home, like I was the reason he could wake up in the dirt and still smile. He said Tommy carried that ring everywhere, wrapped in that leather pouch, tucked inside his uniform close to his chest, and that every night, before they slept, he would take it out, hold it between his fingers, and whisper something, always soft, always private, like a prayer. Nate wrote that in the final weeks, the noise had gotten worse, the fighting closer, and Tommy gave him the pouch with the ring and the letter and said, if something happens to me, find her, return this, she'll understand. And Nate promised, not knowing how long it would take, not knowing that decades might pass before he could keep his word. He never forgot, he said. He kept it safe, carried it home, then moved 3 times, got married, lost his wife, joined the post office, and one day, found the pouch again at the bottom of an old trunk while packing up a room he hadn't touched in years. And just like that, the promise returned. He wrote, I'm sorry it took so long. I didn't know if it was right, if it would reopen things that time tried to close, but I knew I had to send it, and I hope somehow, in some quiet place, he knows I did. I wrote back immediately, not with anger, not with pain, but with gratitude. And in my letter, I told him everything Tommy had meant, everything the ring had meant, everything that still lived in me even now. And when I mailed it, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because the story was done, but because the story was still mine. And the ring, now warm again on my hand, no longer felt like a question. It felt like a promise kept. I thought I would keep it all to myself. The ring, the letters, the silence that lived between the years, the boy who became my husband, the soldier who never came home. The promise returned in silver after decades of waiting. I thought some stories belonged to the quiet, to the space between breaths, to the stillness of a rocking chair and the hum of a kettle left too long on the stove. I thought that telling it out loud might make it vanish, like fog touched by sun, or maybe I was just afraid of hearing it in my own voice, of realizing how much it still hurt. But life, as it turns out, does not like to be boxed up, not even in tin, not even beneath folded handkerchiefs and carefully tied ribbons. Life wants to breathe, to stretch, to unfold itself in the company of others who know what it is to carry something heavy and still smile at the morning light. It started small, with my niece Olivia, who came by on a Sunday with her 2 boys and a basket of fresh muffins. She asked if I still had that old photograph of Uncle Tommy in his uniform, the one where he's holding a puppy in one hand and a chocolate bar in the other. I laughed, told her yes, it was in the cedar chest, wrapped in a scarf that still smelled faintly of sandalwood and thyme, and she asked if she could show it at her son's school for Veterans Day. Just a small thing, she said, just a few kids and stories. I almost said no. I almost told her to leave the past where it belonged, but something in her eyes made me pause, something gentle and eager and full of that same curiosity I once had, and so I said yes, and I pulled out the photo. And then I pulled out one of the letters too, the one where Tommy describes teaching someone to dance in the mud, and the way he ends it with, I'll waltz with you again someday. And she read it and cried, and I didn't. Not that time. The next week, her son came back with a handmade thank you card, a drawing of Tommy with a big smile and a ring in his hand, and a note that said thank you for being brave. And I sat at the table and stared at that little piece of crayon love and realized something I hadn't before. This story was never just mine. I began writing it down, not in the way I wrote letters to him, but in a new notebook, the kind with thick pages and a blue fabric cover. I wrote down the day he asked me to marry him, the way the flower clung to my dress, the exact color of the ribbon I tied around his bag. I wrote down the silence, the ache, the knock at the door. The moment I put the ring back on my hand, not to mourn, but to remember. Word got out somehow, maybe through Olivia, maybe through the wind, maybe through the way I started to hum again when I made tea. And soon the pastor asked if I would speak at the town hall memorial. Just a few words, just a small remembrance, and I said yes before my fear could say no, and that's how it began. I stood on the little wooden stage with the microphone too low and the lights too soft, and I told them about Tommy, not the soldier, but the man, the boy who played harmonica by the river, who taught me how to parallel park in the church parking lot, who once caught fireflies for me in a mason jar and told me they were stars come down to say hello. I told them how he took my ring to war, not to forget me, but to carry me with him, how he held it every night like a prayer, how it found its way back to me without a map, because love, real love, does not need directions. It finds its way home on instinct and hope and the steady hands of someone who made a promise in the dirt and kept it decades later. People listened, some with tears, some with silence, some with hands clasped like they were holding something too. And after, they came to me, young and old, veterans and widows, students and strangers, and they asked for more. They asked for his words, for my letters, for the quiet pieces of history that never made it into textbooks. So I shared, not everything, not all at once, but enough to show them that love doesn't end in war, that promises can sleep and still wake, that a silver ring can outlive the hand that once placed it and still carry its warmth. The librarian offered to scan the letters, make a collection for the local archive. The high school invited me to speak each November. The local paper printed his picture on the front page with a headline that read, "The ring that found its way home." And every time I saw it, I felt proud, not just of Tommy, but of us, of what we survived, of what we kept alive. I even received a letter from another soldier, someone who had served with Nate Carter years later, who had heard the story and wrote to thank me, said it reminded him that kindness lasts, that promises matter, that even in chaos, someone is always watching, always remembering, always choosing to do the right thing. One afternoon, I walked to the little memorial park on Main Street, where the names are carved into stone and the flags are always fresh, and I placed a copy of his letter beneath his name, tucked into a small envelope with a sprig of lavender, and I whispered, "You did it, sweetheart. They remember you." And the wind blew just enough to make the leaves dance, and I let myself believe it was him now. The ring stays on my finger, not because I am waiting, not anymore, but because I am telling, because it is part of the story, because it belongs not just to me, but to every hand that ever reached for love and feared it might not return. And when the children ask me, "Did he really come back?" I say, yes, in every word, in every letter, in every promise kept. He came back, because he did, he always will. They say love fades, they say time wears down even the sharpest edges, even the brightest flames, but that is not what I have known, not what I have lived, not what I have carried in my hands and in my bones, because love, when it is real, when it is rooted in something deeper than youth or circumstance or photographs, does not fade. It folds itself into the fabric of everything. It becomes the way you brush your hair back, the way you turn the key in the door, the way your fingers rest on a teacup just a little longer than they need to. It's been so many years since that train pulled away, since I watched Tommy disappear behind the glass, holding my ring and smiling like we had forever. And in some way, we did, not in years or decades, not in what the world could see or measure, but in something else, something softer, quieter, more eternal than time. Now, my hair is white, my hands are soft and spotted, my steps are slower, and my voice has settled into the rhythm of memory, but the ring still fits. It rests on the same finger where he placed it, not at the altar, not before a crowd, but in the space between cinnamon rolls and sunlight. When the world was small and our love was just beginning to unfold, I still live in the same house. The walls have seen seasons come and go, have heard laughter and silence, music and mourning. They've watched me move through every shade of grief and grace, and in every room, there is something of him, not just photographs, but pieces of our life, the way the curtains still catch the light, just so. The worn path in the floor where he used to pace while reading, the way the porch creaks under my rocking chair in the exact same way it did when he kissed me goodbye, the garden still blooms each spring, and the lavender he planted in the corner comes back stronger every year. And I like to think that's him, coming back again and again, reminding me that nothing planted in love ever really dies. It just changes form, just finds new ways to be seen, to be felt, to be known. Children still come by the house, some for school projects, some just curious, some whose grandparents told them about the story of the ring. And I tell it gladly now. I tell it with pride and with softness. I let them hold a copy of one of his letters, the ink faded but his words still shining. I show them the ring and say, "This traveled through a war and waited decades to find its way home." And they listen with wide eyes and small hearts, learning how to love bravely. Sometimes I wonder what Tommy would think of all this, of the newspaper clippings and the school displays, the letters tucked into local history books, the quilt, a group of veterans made with his name stitched into a corner like a secret, like a promise. I think he'd blush, smile, shake his head and say it was too much fuss, but I also think he'd be glad, not for the attention, but for the remembering, because that's what scared him most, being forgotten. But he isn't. He is remembered in the stories we tell, in the letters we read, in the way I still hum while sweeping the kitchen floor, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, when I swear I feel the weight of his hand on mine. He is remembered in the ring, now warm with decades of holding, in the porch light I still turn on every night, not because I think he'll walk through the door, but because I like knowing that some lights never go out, because someone still might need them to find their way home. He is remembered in the way I never stopped writing, in the way I signed every letter with love, even when no one would read them, even when the words were only meant for my own healing, because the act of loving, truly loving, is not always about being seen. It's about staying, about standing in the storm and keeping the door open anyway. Now, I write less often, but I still sit with the letters sometimes, spread them out on the table, read a line or two, and then just close my eyes and remember, not the pain, not the waiting, but the sound of his voice, the weight of his promises, the warmth of the life we built in words and memory and hope. And I speak to him, not every day, not always aloud, but often enough to feel him near, enough to keep the air around me familiar. And when I do, I always say thank you. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for loving me with a kind of courage that the world could not bury. Thank you for the ring, for the letters, for the story that will live long after I am gone, because that is what we leave behind in the end. Not things, not wealth, not even names carved in stone, but the way we loved, the way we kept our word, the way we lit a lamp in the window and believed, even in the darkest hour, that someone would come home. I do not know where Tommy is buried, not for certain. I do not know what happened in those final moments, whether he was afraid or calm, whether he had time to pray, whether he thought of me, but I choose to believe he did, because he always did, because I always felt it. And now, when my time comes, I hope they bury me with the ring, not as a symbol of loss, but of return, of promises kept, of love that lived longer than war, longer than waiting, longer than the space between here and there. I hope that when someone finds our story, decades from now, in a dusty drawer or an old archive, they'll read it and smile, and feel a little braver, a little softer, a little more willing to wait, and to love anyway. And if they ask what happened to the woman with the ring, tell them she lived, not just waited. Tell them she remembered, not just grieved. Tell them she loved, truly loved, and that was enough, because it always was, and it always will be.